The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm your host, Len B.A., and my guests today are Patrice Keet and Melissa LaHommedieu. They are co-authors of the just-released book, Melissa, Come Back. Patrice Keet was a marriage and family therapist for 30 years with experience in private practice and school settings. She hosted a talk radio program called Heart to Heart on KNRY and Seaside for 2 years. She co-founded a children's museum in Santa Cruz, California, served on numerous nonprofit boards of directors, and raised 2 of her own children in addition to being a non-traditional mother to Melissa and her 2 daughters. Melissa Come Back is her first book. Melissa LaHommedieu is a supervising social worker for the County of Santa Cruz, where she specializes in matching individuals and families with stable housing solutions. She is the proud mother of 2 college-aged daughters and a star performer in her local karaoke scene. Melissa is a regular speaker at events supporting foster care programs. She's a proud member of the board of directors of CASA of Santa Cruz County. Patrice and Melissa, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Len.
I have to say first, I've been reading the book. I haven't finished it, but it's really touching to have you both here in person after reading the account of what you each went through respectively, and how your lives came together. And so it's just, for me, and I hope as the interview progresses for our listening audience, to have the reality of your friendship and companionship at this point in your lives, knowing what's come before, a little of what's come before is really moving. So thank you for being here. The book's really like 2 separate accounts. I mean, each of your stories about the time leading up to, during, and after you, Melissa, were a foster child in the care of Patrice and her husband. Mm-hmm. I love the way it's written, with the chapters alternating between your respective memories of those times. And I wondered if you each could take a moment to give kind of a brief summary of the situations you each came from at the time that you first met and your lives came together. And maybe Patrice, would you like to start?
Sure, I would love to do that. I was a marriage family therapist for probably 10 years at that point, and I was doing school counseling, and a teacher referred Melissa to me. And this is any of you budding therapists out there, this is very unusual. As soon as Melissa walked in, I felt an affinity with her when she walked in and was drawn to her. And she started telling me the story of the multiple foster homes that she had been in and the one that she had just been placed in a number of months before, which did not sound good. She talked about as she talked, I pictured her on a merry-go-round of foster home placements. And it broke my heart, especially when she talked about the kind of family that she wanted, that she knew she would get at some point in her life with great determination. And she was so clear about that, and it sounded like the family that I had created and lived in with my husband of many years and our 2 children. And I thought, she would fit in here. We have the resources, we have the desire, we love children. Our daughter had just gone off to college and our son was in high school. We still had parenting energy and love, and I just fell in love with her like nothing, it was kind of weird right away, and started the process. Talked to my husband, talked to the principal of the school, and one thing led to another, and very rapidly, within about 3 weeks, she was living in our home as a foster child. So that's the setting.
Mine was quite different. When I came to meet Patrice, I had been removed from my biological family at roughly the age of 7.5. And I was initially placed in a familial foster home with my paternal aunt. And I stayed there for a short period of time, but ultimately it didn't work out. And I was placed, I was actually sent back to California into a traditional foster home. And by the time we had met, I had been in enough homes to kind of become accustomed to like a cycle of meet and greet. And at the time that I met Patrice, there was no differentiating between titles, who was who. In my mind, it was just like, oh, here's another adult that I'm going to talk about my life and where I'm at. And so my experience was very different. I also felt a connection with her, but there was a detachment as well, because I had come to be detached after so many experiences with therapists and social workers and schools.
Yeah, and you referred to that in your account. Like, I don't know if this is a difficult question for you to answer, but I'll ask, and you feel free to pass. You suffered sexual abuse at a very young age. You were only 7 when your stepfather was arrested as a sex offender. And you wrote in the book that at the time, although you were subjected to all these physical examinations and questioning by, a host of adult strangers, basically, I mean, they're professionals doing their job, but they're strangers, you kept your emotions to yourself. And it was like you couldn't prevent all the probing and investigating, but you could avoid having them witness your emotional state. And that you refer to that again when you talk about leaving your aunt's home, because you kind of thought that was sort of permanent, even though it wasn't, obviously, clearly wasn't ideal. And you were told you're going in foster care, and you didn't even know what it meant. Like, what is foster care?
Right. I thought I was already there. So
yeah, right. Could you talk about navigating those emotions and that act of keeping it to yourself or dissociating alternately?
Yeah. So dissociating is the exact term that we're referring to, and it's very commonly observed with individuals who've experienced trauma. I had plenty of it at that point, and I think what seems to strike people about my account of that is that it's surprising to them that when I am removed from my biological home after experiencing such horrific abuse, that medical professionals are viewed in the same capacity. But there really was no differentiating that to me. And I had kept that. There's such a level of shame associated with it. And it's a secret, right? If secrets weren't involved, then predators wouldn't get away with the acts that they do. And so I had already been primed to hold things in, to hold emotions in, and to present a front. So I think at that time I was already a very skilled actress.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, and it speaks to that the issue of the presence of trauma then in so many people's lives, and how much the inability to or the sense that you can't communicate about it, or like you described situations of your stepfather telling you can't tell anybody, and threatening you, and that's it's like, how do you? It's hard for me to even imagine that at the age that you were subjected to that. That's just like, even at even as adults, if we're under threat like that, it's a traumatic experience. So to have that at that really vulnerable age is profound. And so the coping is, that's demonstrated in the account is really extraordinary. And there's such, and also the way you've structured the book, there's such a contrast, the alternate chapters, like Patrice, you're talking about, the conversations you're having with your family, with your friends, with the professionals who work in the foster care agencies, like the things you're trying to resolve. Who's it going to work with? How is it going to work with your kids? How's it going to work with your husband? What does everybody think of this idea? And so there's that going back and forth, going on in your chapters. And then the alternate chapters, Melissa, you're describing these very shadowy situations, where it's clearly, it's amazing. The clarity of your memories is amazing, because you have some amazing detail in there about your relationships with other kids in the foster homes and so forth. And at the same time, it's as if you're going down, a dark corridor, and every once in a while this window opens and there's some light comes in, and then you're back in the dark. That contrast is there, and it really lends a lot of depth to the story. And I wondered if you had anticipated writing it that way, or if that came about as you developed the idea to collaborate on writing this.
Well, I had always wanted it to be very separate writing of it, and not to know what Melissa was writing until later on. My vision was that we would each describe situations, and I would learn more about her, she would learn more about me in this process, and that we wouldn't share information that was happening. So I learned a lot of things that were very valuable to me in our current relationship through her recitation of what happened to her. So yes, and also it was structured in the way that, we knew that really heavy life and difficult life she was living the reader needed a break, and would get too ponderous and just too heavy. And so, the lightness of my life and the fact that, I had so many privileges that I could think about bringing a child into my family. I wasn't at a survival level like Melissa was. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it was structured that way.
I think an aspect of it was amplified just it was like a function of just honesty. So, we were very calculated in keeping our accounts very, very separate so that we could be as honest as possible. And I think that was one of the goals of the book, is to relay an authenticity so that people could feel that and relate in their own way.
Yeah, that really comes through loud and clear. If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at K-Squid, my guests are Patrice Keet and Melissa LaHommedieu, who are co-authors of the just-released book, Melissa Come Back. And Patrice, among other things, was a marriage and family therapist for many years, and Melissa is a supervising social worker now for the County of Santa Cruz. So, as you tell this story and it begins to unfold, and the time comes, as you said, it was only about 3 weeks from the time you met to the time Melissa moves into your home, and I know this was a big change, but also you, Melissa, seem to have had a sense of going towards something like that. Like you immediately really you get your own bedroom and you claim it. Like you're going to put this here, you're going to put that there. You know what you're about when you get there. And I wonder if you could talk about that transition time. Like obviously you don't know that it's going to last any longer than any of your other placements, but it is a very different setting than the other homes you've been in. And I wondered if you could talk about what that transition was like.
Honestly, to be completely transparent, I think that there was an obliviousness to it. I had learned to become detached. I wasn't even capable of making close connections in the homes, particularly when I initially entered them, because I didn't have an expectation that I was going to stay. I think that a lot of the excitement and the kind of like take charge is very related to what I refer to as like my Brady Bunch fantasy in the book. I had built up this essentially a delusion about what life would be like in an ideal world if I were living with my biological family. Everything kind of rested on that. And even though I had an understanding from previous experiences that it was not remotely near the Brady Bunch, in my young mind, if I was back with my biological family, that would just solve all of my problems. So the majority of the homes that I went into, I shared rooms, often bunk beds or multiple bunk beds in a room. So there can be, 2 to 4 girls. I think in one placement, there was 6 or 8 of us in one bedroom.
Wow.
And so when I walked into a room and I had this like giant bed to myself, it was just like, that's like the closest that I had ever been to that Brady Bunch fantasy. And I also allude to a level of manipulation in the book as well. There's a what I refer to as a honeymoon stage when you enter a new home. You come in like sparkly clean and brand new, and you don't have any experiences, and there's no resentments, and there's not a whole lot of rule enforcement because everybody's getting to know each other. And so I think a lot of my reactions were calculated in the sense that I wanted that honeymoon phase to last as long as possible.
And at that point, you already had a sense that there was a honeymoon phase, right? That it starts off a little more spontaneous, let's say, and then it goes into some kind of a very strict context.
Oh, yeah. I was very aware of it, and I was using it to my advantage, and I understood that the longer I could make that last, then the longer I could have a sense of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was my sense of control in the situation.
Sure. Yeah, and at that point, you're all of 9 years old. And you said you were kind of oblivious. I mean, heck, I was oblivious until I was 29 at least. So, I don't think that's unusual for a young child to be not particularly tuned in to all the nuance of what's going on around them. And so that's pretty normal. But it's so interesting because it seems, on reflection that you were, and perhaps the trauma has something to do with this, and this is purely speculative, but that you're already pretty tuned in to strategies for coping with circumstances and ways to try and kind of, as it were, keep your head above water no matter what happens.
Well, I think what we observe in many of my chapters in particular is that there's an aspect of learning that's involved with it, but those strategies and those coping mechanisms were adapted in my very early childhood in my biological home. And so the strategies and techniques that I took into new homes, into healthy environments, were somewhat tainted by that. Mm-hmm. Those behaviors were very adaptive in the dynamic that I grew up in, which was very dysfunctional and abusive. And so when you take those coping mechanisms and those survival techniques and you put them in a new environment, it's like taking a fish and putting it in a desert. It can't breathe the same way. It's not mobile the same way. It can't survive.
Yeah. And Patrice, you talked about your initial meetings with Melissa, how you were really struck by her energy, because there was a certain, in a sense, like an outward, like optimism and a willingness to communicate at least what you think you're getting communication-wise, understanding that, of course, kids are keeping some things to themselves. But that there was something in all of that interaction that struck you as unusual. And I wonder if you could talk about those contrasts, because you spent a lot of time as a school counselor. You've spent time with a lot of different children, your own, your grandchildren, and all these children you'd encountered in your work, in your professional life. Could you talk a little bit about the contrast between what you saw with your initial encounters with Melissa and what you more often saw with other children?
Sure. From what I had heard from her teacher, I expected a sort of downtrodden little girl to come in my office, and she burst in like she had just won the lottery, with confidence on the outside and energy and savoir-faire about dealing with adults. She, at one point after we talked about her, she said, "And how about you? Do you like your job?" Very mature, kind of, okay. And I was just taken with her resilience. That I sat all through my meeting with her, I was thinking, how could a girl who has been through what she's describing and what I can imagine from my work in the past be so buoyant and optimistic and playful? And she went over to a dollhouse that I had set up for play therapy, and she just casually said, "Oh, my therapist has one of these in her office, but I like yours better." And she just was charming, a charming, darling girl that I could see fitting into my life. And I have to say that I am generally a bit impulsive and also an optimist and expansive. And someone said it to me yesterday, you inspire me to go big. And I kind of go big. And so the idea just struck me, and I manifested it, and it was exciting. So she was different in all those ways.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, now you've got lots of history together. Would you say Patrice is impulsive?
Yeah, I don't think she understands that there's a shallow end of the pool. She just jumps into the deep end. That's what she's immediately attracted to. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's a great analogy. So, in the course of the story, of course, you go through some period of time where things are, there's a honeymoon period, right? But other things start to come up, and I wonder if you could just kind of give us a sense of how conflicts begin to manifest, or discomfort, or those things that started to create friction for you.
Well, they were all things that, had I put on my clinical professional hat, would have been expected. But I went into this situation with not only optimism, but with a certain amount of hubris that I had the secret sauce. My husband, and that my husband and I had the secret sauce of child rearing. We had 2 super cool kids, and I'd always related well to kids. So I thought, okay, we've got love, we've got a home, we've got resources, we've got energy, and to the point where I say this in the book, I didn't even want to read Melissa's file, and I did not, about her childhood. And I convinced my husband, who is just a wonderful person, to go down and read the file, because I wanted to give her a fresh start. Then this is addressed to any of you out there who are thinking about becoming foster parents or are currently foster parents. Fresh starts are hard to come by. And Melissa had a lot of baggage. I had my share of baggage, very different than hers. And it's not as easy to plunk somebody into the environment. I mean, we had so many differences that still manifest themselves to this day. Everything from some of the ways we look at the world, the way, culturally experiences. I know in the book, at one point, Melissa said that it was so shocking to her in our household that you could have as much food as you wanted, that you could go out to dinner and a movie on the same night. Things that I took for granted and take for granted. So I started out with hubris, and then as problems started coming up, mainly Melissa reacting to me and projecting a lot of stuff on me as, I guess, as her mother. And I was also the more strict, rule-setting person in the household and had high expectations for she, and continues to be, I hope this doesn't sound condescending in any way, smart as can be. She's so smart. And she was a smart little kid. And I was like, oh, man, she'll just blossom in school when she's in the right school. And eventually she did. But I just want to say it's not that easy, a fresh start. And it was very naive of me. And so I didn't use what I knew, which was slow down, let Melissa evolve, let this relationship evolve. I didn't ask for enough help. I didn't call her CASA or her social worker enough. I'm like, I can tough this out. We can, and then she's saying she didn't open up much. Mm-hmm. And that was because I'm a real processor and expresser. And like, tell me what's bothering you. And she didn't have the words for it then. She's great about that now, but she didn't have the words. And so I was flummoxed, like, okay, she's mad at me. I don't know what I did besides say, could you pick up your stuff? And then there were there's some funny incidents in the book. There's about one funny scene where Melissa steals someone's wallet in Kmart, which was absolutely out of my realm of dealing with in my own household. And it I don't want to spoil it because it's pretty funny how it ends. But so I was dealing with things in my home that I had dealt with in my office, but not in my own home. And I thought that I had the resources. So it was a humbling experience. And I got worn down as I saw myself failing. And I started feeling worse and worse about myself. And I think I probably put more and more expectations on Melissa to be different. And frankly, I had no idea how much her biological family was drawing her like quicksand back into trying to into their family. So I was kind of working against a lot of odds and conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and anytime you feel like you tell yourself that I can tough this out, you're probably on the wrong path.
Yeah, I would say that. It's true.
Yeah. So there is that pull, and it's continuous really through your life, because there is that sense of, like, you were very close with your brother, Melissa, mm-hmm. and he of course is on in a different situation than yours. Your mother had a pretty troubled life, your biological mother, and there's a lot going on, but that pull is still there. And I wonder if you could talk about how that has played out through your experience in your time living with Patrice and her family, and since.
Well, I think that the pull was very present with my biological family in general, and I think that it was amplified by the fact that I was removed from their care without consent. I mean, in my mind, I was kidnapped. Just to put it into context. So nobody had that right. There was nothing in my mind that they could have done that would have justified me being kidnapped from my family and not allowed to see them and engage with them the way that I wanted to. And so having developed that perspective, which is somewhat inevitable, like the very act of removing a child from their home, no matter how abusive or dysfunctional it is, it's a traumatizing event. And I clung to that trauma very, very vehemently because it was fresh. It was more fresh to me. The trauma of the sexual abuse that had been resolved in a certain sense, not in a positive way in my mind, but My stepfather he went to prison, and in my mind, I was the cause of all of that. If I hadn't done the one thing that he told me not to do, which was tell, then I wouldn't have been removed. So I think that there was a sense of responsibility there too. So when I would go to visits and my biological family would say, you need to come home. Nobody's going to love you like we love you. You belong with us. I believed that. I believed that I was never going to belong anywhere else. And I felt that. I felt like I didn't belong in any of the homes that I was in, no matter how healthy they were. And I carried that theme with me long past my childhood into my early adulthood. And it's pretty safe to say that it probably impacts me to this day. I have a lot more knowledge around it, but it's always an influence for me.
Yeah, and would you say that seems like a dynamic that's always true with anyone who's separated from their family, whether it's in foster care situation or for any other reason, that there is that sense, especially when you're taken by the authorities, or forced to leave by other circumstances, that there is that sense of, being captive in the situation beyond your control.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a really short break. We will be right back after this. Don't touch that dial. If you're just joining us here on Talk of the Bay, my guests today are Patrice Keet and Melissa LaHommedieu. They have just released a book that they co-authored entitled Melissa Come Back, which is the account of, it's more than just the story of Melissa's life with being taken in as a foster child by Patrice's family. It goes beyond that, but we've been talking particularly about the events that are described in the first part of the book, how they came together. And so just to take us now down the road a ways, you did get to a point where you, Patrice, and your family, to a large degree, I'm sure, are tied into all of this, come to a point where you're having a great deal of difficulty dealing with Melissa as she's growing, despite the fact that, at first it looks like, she's finally got, a really good home to be in. It's, you've got good resources. You're not subject to anything that we would call abuse in normal textbook terms. Not to impugn anything, but, how kids experience things that happen can feel very negative, even if the intent behind it is completely positive. So all of that is going on. And then maybe I don't want to have you give away too much of the story here, because obviously people are not going to get the dynamism of it or the emotional depth of it if you tell the whole story here on the air. Not that we have time, but I wonder if you could kind of give us a sense of that trajectory from the time when you're really encountering a great deal of difficulty in your respective relationship, and what transpires. And obviously the title is a clue to say Melissa Come Back. Obviously something happens there that isn't what you originally imagined when you first took her in.
Right. In fact, my husband and I were on a business trip of his, and just cut to the chase, Melissa ran away. And we were thousands of miles away on our way home. We're like, what happened? Why doesn't she want to live with us? We knew that. I knew. And my husband, I would say he basically never has had or continues no problems with Melissa. He's completely accepting, and Melissa's shaking her head.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Accepting of her and her children, and I was the one pushing limits and being more critical. And So Melissa ends up running away. And do you want to say what happens with the social worker? And
Yeah. I guess it's kind of difficult to surmise it without giving too much away. But I think that after I ran away, there was kind of an understanding that I was going to be going back. Because in the previous homes that I had been in, that's what happened. I didn't have a choice. I would tell people that I didn't want to go, or I would even in some cases disclose abuse that was going on in the home. And for some reason, it just seemed like I always went back to the homes that I had attempted to run away from. And so I wasn't expecting to be successful in my attempt. And in addition to that, I was also very emotionally closed off because I was angry and I was harboring a lot of resentments. That my inability to communicate my feelings and my emotional state made it really difficult for people to reach me and to connect with me. And I hadn't been given an opportunity at any point to develop those skills, and we hadn't really had enough time together. And I don't think that anybody at that point was aware of what I was doing. And I think it's probably safe to say that even at that age, I had an idea about it, but the nuances and complexities of it and the effects, I was not equipped to understand. So I did end up not going back to their home, and I ended up in a group home. And that was how we became estranged. I was 11 years old at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we never knew until the book that she expected that she would come back to our home. We would have loved that, and we wanted that. But we didn't know that. We thought she ran away. That's what she wants to do. I was begging her out the window, don't go, come back. And so we thought it was the end of it, that we needed to listen to what she wanted, that there was something that wasn't fitting for her in our family. And then when the social worker and then her other worker and ended up facilitating her going to another home, we thought, okay, this doesn't make sense to us because we still feel like we can do it and we want to, but we need to listen to her. And I think, Melissa, you've said that you kind of think that you thought it was the last stop, right? That you would be in a group home forever. And I think it got really crazy. I already felt like a failure. I wasn't able to make her happy, to make her express herself and want to be with us. So it's like, okay, she wants to go. It's not what we want. And no idea that she expected to have us come get her or they would bring her back. So that's where it's a little Shakespearean, she's sitting there with her needs. We're sitting there with our needs. There's no bridge, and it's a pathetic situation. And it took me and my husband years to make peace with it. It was really hard to, especially being a mental health professional. And I would go around and give parenting talks and write articles on parenting, and here I'd failed, and it was, Melissa used the word shame about something else, but shameful and demoralizing, and it was a very hard time.
I think we both ended up internalizing that experience.
Yes, I'd say that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's lovely we now speak the same language. She's been to psychology, studied psychology, and we have great talks.
But ultimately, not only did you again live with Patrice, but you and your daughters lived with her. Is that right?
Yes, we ended up reuniting sometime later in serendipitous events. I don't want to give away too much,
right?
But it was it was not anything that you could have foreseen, and it might have been something similar to like a corny rom-com movie that is just like so far beyond the, you know, believable reality of what you could expect. So yeah, that's our spoiler alert. We reunite. Who would have guessed? Here we are.
And I fell in love with her, and my husband did too, a second time.
Yeah.
You know, we got a second chance. We almost named the book Second Time Around, or Better This Time. We went through Better This Time for years, because it took a long time to write. But we got a second chance, and so did they. Yeah,
and you've now created this book, which, I mean, you know, as I said, I haven't finished it, but it's very... it really has, you know, it's very moving account. And it really, you know, because I think of your authenticity in telling your respective experiences. And it's perfect, the juxtaposition of these short alternating chapters, first yours, Patrice, then yours, Melissa, going back and forth, that you really, it's almost literary. You know, I think of, what was his name? There was an English author who wrote a book called the Alexandria Quartet, where he tells the same story from 4 different people's perspective. And there's some of that quality in your book that you really I get a really clear sense of, well, here's one version of what's happening. Here's another version of what's happening. It's not that the facts that you can pick out as facts don't agree. It's just that the experience of what that means is so different for each of you. And so to come around to the point where your lives progress to the point where you're able to see through the other person's eyes in a different way, or a little bit more, is extraordinary. And I think, you know, as a metaphor for other changes we go through in life, it's really a valuable story to see that, you know, how we can have very different perspectives, and ultimately, you know, life continues to shape us as we continue to try to shape our lives, and we can learn to see in a different way. And that I think was, you know, is one of the really profound gifts of the book.
Thank you.
So I wanted to maybe speak more broadly, because I know, for example, Melissa, you do some advocacy work around foster care. And, and, you know, nowadays, I'll say nowadays in quotes, you know, we understand a great deal more about why it's difficult for children to go into foster care, why things don't always work out, even to, you know, people who think they'll be the ideal parent, and yet it's so difficult, you know, once they're actually, you know, on the ground going through day-to-day life with this child that, you know, maybe they didn't even meet until that child was, you know, 7 or 9 or 12 or 15. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about foster care and the issues that you're particularly aware of, having been through so much of it, that you observe in your own work and your own exposure to people in our community.
Yeah, it's a heavy lift.
I know we only have, you know, 11 minutes left. So,
I mean, I think that experience kind of speaks to the need for advocacy. And it was one of the saving graces in my personal experience, is that I was connected to additional supports. You know, when you think about the contributing factors that lead people into, you know, the child welfare system, or even into like dysfunctional systems that, you know, like force kids to run away, I think a lot of it has to do with abuse, but fundamentally, I believe that it boils down to a lack of support. And I think that speaks to it's like an all-encompassing, you know, kind of umbrella that speaks to, you know, cycles of poverty, cycles of violence, cycles of there's multiple cycles that it speaks to. Even you could take a healthy family who is, doesn't have necessarily aggressive behaviors, and you put them in the right situation, and they're going to adapt dysfunctional behaviors in order to survive. Mm-hmm. And so, in my opinion, the solution is support. And I think that what we're seeing is less and less people have access to supports. I think all around. I think that that's just becoming part of the human experience right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely, we've seen an enormous shift in, wealth and resources and the concept of what's appropriate, in our country. And then, if you look around the world, the kinds of supports that are available vary quite a lot. But even in some very poor countries, there's an enormous network of family support, for example, kinship relationships. And then in some really wealthy countries, like particularly in Western Europe, you see a whole lot of, social services, even just simple things like, okay, we had this child tax credit under COVID relief legislation, and now it's going away. And that child tax credit took millions of families, out of the nominal poverty level, which isn't to say it made life easy, but, we really saw a statistical change in people's, you could say, material well-being. And that's now disappeared again. So what does that mean? Where do these, if they're working, should they be permanent? If they're not, working, are they working partly? Are they working, it's not like we're tackling those questions as a society. It's it's more like a theater that's being acted out in terms of the political world.
Right. But it doesn't impact everybody the same way, I think, is what really stands out to me. You can take an individual who experiences, like a major life change, say they lose their job or they lose their housing. Those are really traumatic events, but an individual who doesn't have a support system around them, they don't have anybody to go to and say, I need help. They don't have an aunt or an uncle or a close friend or someone that can allow them to stay in their home while they kind of get back up on their feet, right? And I think that that's a common story, particularly in our area, because, most people are just like one paycheck away from homelessness. So when I talk about support really being the key, that's what I'm referring to, is that it creates inequity. And people who have more financial resources tend to be connected to more supports as well.
But they aren't necessarily the same thing.
Right.
Because there are people who are financially in pretty good shape, but when any kind of, real challenge, whether it's health or, loss of a loved one or, even just a radical change in circumstances, loss of a job, different people, as you say, they respond differently to that depending on the support they can get access, and also their understanding of their ability to get support, and their how much support they're entitled to. It seems like there's I've watched a kind of a cultural shift, between my father's generation and mine, where there was a time when, men who believed in, cooperation and collectivism also would be very reluctant to ask for personal support. And there's still a lot of that sentiment around, but it's no longer sort of the standard. It's now it's very much more diverse in terms of attitudes, and that, so even if you have the potential for support, if you're unable to ask for it, it's not going to be there when you need it, or not going to be there as soon as you would benefit from it. So it's an interesting challenge, and I think one that we all witness, in just walking down the street in daily life here.
Yeah. And one area of support that Melissa and I so strongly believe in is the support that foster children do get, and particularly through the organization of CASA, the board that Melissa sits on and I sat on for a long time. The stories that I heard in my therapy office and in schools about how a child, and even adults will tell me, how one person made a difference in their life. One mentor, one teacher who believed in them, and as you're saying, kinship, one relative, and that those kinship networks are definitely fraying. But we really believe in that. And so I would ask your listeners, as Melissa believes as well, if they would like to make a difference in a child's life. CASA is a wonderful organization where you become a mentor to a foster child, see them through their court process, and help figure out the trajectory of their lives. So it's a wonderful organization.
And CASA volunteers also stay with the children when they're in different foster care situations, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it provides a sense of stability throughout a lot of instability. In addition to a sense of connectedness with another person who genuinely is there just to care for you and has your best interests at heart. I think that's one of the things that made it difficult for me to trust people, because it seemed like all of these adults running around me, regardless of who they were, whether it's a psychologist or it's a therapist or a social worker or a teacher, I felt like they all had an agenda. Like they all wanted me to do something or wanted me to change or to be a certain way. And my CASA advocate didn't ask me to do any of that. She was simply there for me. So it provided me with a level of, her acceptance of me provided me with a small sense of belonging that was very, very impactful for me. And it's what's motivated me to stay engaged with them for as long as I have. Yeah.
Yeah. Very critical.
And part of the proceeds of our book will go to support local CASA. So we're happy about that. And we feel like this is a story that is valuable to prospective foster parents, people in any part of the juvenile justice system. Mm-hmm. It's a story of sort of recovery and redemption and hope and the ability and the wonder of creating an intentional family.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. And especially, people talk about intentional families and they're referring to, getting together with other adults.
Right.
But anytime you bring a child into that who isn't biologically your family, it seems like that's, for many people, that's like harder to comprehend. How could that possibly work? Or we don't know what we're getting into, because you can't have that adult to adult conversation, and which kind of speaks to what you talked about in the challenges you faced, trying to be a foster parent, that there's a lot you didn't know about Melissa, and there's a lot Melissa didn't have the capacity or the background to be able to take a active role in working out the relationship.
Right.
You're an 11-year-old kid. Like, how much can you really contribute to making that relationship work?
Mm-hmm.
So, I just really appreciate that you've brought all this into the light. And I'm going to mention, before I forget to, for those listening who don't know what CASA is, it stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. Advocates, in this case, is the organization. And these are people who voluntarily take responsibility for kind of sticking with a child that's in foster care through all the stuff they have to go through, whether it's actual legal stuff, social services that they're supposed to make use of, issues coming up in school, and the families they're placed with. And so that's an incredibly important support system that we are fortunate to have a really great organization in our community here in Santa Cruz County that does just that. But they do need more volunteers. So, say that.
I also just want to mention that there's many ways to become involved and to contribute. There's volunteering, there's joining the board, there's providing insight, there's sharing information, there's donation. Another event that we have coming up is a fundraising event, Move for CASA, and information to register to donate to that can be found at casaofsantacruz.org/move.
Great.
And you can find all the information there.
Great. Well, we have just a little over a minute left, and I want to invite you both to say anything else that comes to mind. And thank you again for this beautiful book, Melissa Come Back, which is now available in local bookstores.
Yes, and today we just put it in Kelly's bookstore in Watsonville, so I want to give them a plug. So we are in Bookshop Santa Cruz. We're in Two Birds bookstore on 41st and Kelly's bookstore. And we have events coming up. You can go to our website, melissacomeback.com, and see the upcoming events that are happening. We have 2 of them in May, and there'll be more scheduled. So we're out there, and it's also on Amazon. And so we'd love people. We want the story to be out in the world.
I second that.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and your really poignant questions. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for, this really deeply touching book. So Patrice Keet and Melissa LaHommedieu, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for being on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you.
Thank you.